Hello. I wish you doing well. Inquisition, Latin, Inquisitio Hereticae Pravitatis, literally, the investigation of heretical heresy, a court or a Catholic court specially active in the 15th and 16th centuries, whose mission is to discover and punish those who violate the Church. The Inquisition is an exceptional ecclesiastical jurisdiction that Pope Gregory IX instituted to suppress, throughout the Christian world, crimes of heresy and apostasy, and acts of witchcraft, from the 13th to 16th centuries. We can add to this that the Inquisition, originally created to fight heretics, Cathars, Votois et Paderines, is against other heresies in magic and in Spain, where it remains for a long time, against Jews and converted Muslims. It is also often used as a political tool. For example, in France, King Philippe le Bel used it against the Templars. Throughout history, there have been many such specialized courts. It is possible to distinguish between three different inspection courts, which have separate clauses. The medieval Inquisition, which was brought before the ecclesiastical courts by Pope Innocent III in 1199. 3. The Spanish Inquisition, a subsidiary of the King of Spain, founded in 1478, and which the Portuguese Inquisition relied on, and the Inquisition in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. The Roman Inquisition, a complex of Roman and International Inquisition, founded in 1542, which was renamed in 1909 by the Sacred Complex of the Holy Office Sacrée Congregation du Saint Office. It was cancelled in the 19th century and replaced by the Holy Synod of Belief and Belief in the Vatican, and the Inquisition is one of the most notorious institutions of humankind. Not exceeding 13,000. If the Church had witnessed a period of relative calm after the 9th century, then heresies witnessed a new development in the 11th and 12th centuries, most of the time along the paths of high. Local studies have shown that heresies are often spread in this way, through a word in the mouth. Pilgrims discuss among themselves and with the people of the villages during their steps, and then questions and answers are published outside the parish control authority. In the High Middle Ages, the heretical is like a leper who must be removed from the healthy body by those who believe in church deprivation, then exile or confiscation of his property. In the late Middle Ages, heresy tore apart the social bond. Regent Burnout writes, "Any spiritual accident in this context appears more dangerous than a physical injury." In many ways, the Inquisition is a defensive response to society, whether right or wrong, so preserving faith is as important as physical health these days. In the papal decision Virgentes Insenium March 25, 1199, Pope Innocent III made Innocent III even deviation in dogma similar to crime to the royal self, a Roman concept then rediscovered by the secular authorities. After the creation of the Inquisition, the definition of heresy, which will gradually become the only competent court, will be expanded continuously, to include, in seizure of opportunity, the apostasy of Jews or Muslims converting to a new religion and sorcery, which was formally appointed to them in 1261 by John XXI. We also refer to dissidents as heretics on the occasion of the fight against Frederick II, in the 14th century, the century of the Great Western Schism, and we also call this name to those who refuse to pay tithes but rather homosexuals, buggers or lut people. The increase in the powers of the Inquisition and its constant exemption from censorship explained the absolute authority of the institution in the 13th century, so investigators returned to work on their own and without accountability, allowing them independence with the Church. Heresy is not only a matter of doctrine, it is seen as a global crime against God, the princes, and society. Being torn as a social bond, fighting against heresy is a matter of social order. Therefore, the princes were interested in suppressing it in many ways, and the civil authority began to maintain public order fighting the heresies and punishing the heretics in an independent manner, and Resolution 1184 ad abolendam by Lucius III Pope Lucius III Act of suppressing the heretical factor to establish the power of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa Friedrich I Barbarossa. This confusion of temporal and spiritual domains is common in Europe in the 13th century. In contrast, in southern France, and in the far north of the Kingdom of Aragon, freedom of worship is widely practiced. For example, Jewish consuls are elected in Toulouse, mentioned in the General History of the Languedoc by Dom Vassy. The establishment of the first inspection court in Carcassonne after the Peugeot Crusade is undoubtedly a way to ensure cooperation between the local new lords after disposing of the old. This involvement of the secular authorities brought it into conflict with the authority of the church. Royal or imperial courts ruled on matters of belief. Chapter in this dispute over jurisdiction. Verona settlement 1148. L'arrangement de Veyron. Heretics must be tried by the church before it can be handed over to the secular arm. On the contrary, the church obliges the secular authorities, whose legitimacy is based on the model of the Christian community, to search for heretics, under penalty of expulsion or settlementation. From the start, the Inquisition is based on the principle of cooperation and the sharing of tasks between the church and secular authorities, each working in its field following its responsibilities. Anti-heresy was not born with the Inquisition. Before the establishment of this institution, the search for heretics is vested in the bishop or the bishop, usually the bishop, and punishment for the lay judge. Fighting heresies is not only a papacy, but on the contrary, because of its social dimensions, the state plays this role in partnership with the papacy. The first types of repression appeared in the 11th century early in Christmas 1022, and Robert Lepew burned 10 clergymen from Orleans Cathedral. It was the first Holocaust in the history of the struggle against heresy in the West. After the agreement between Verona Lucius III and Frederick Barbarossa, the Declaration of Adabal and Dam 1184 of the heresy suppression worked as a factor to establish the emperor's power. It was generally used to prosecute heretics by the Roman Catholic Church. This was through clerical trials or courts established by the Roman Catholic Church to suppress or combat heresy, and its mission was to discover and punish witches as the Inquisition burned 59 women in Spain, 36 in Italy and 4 in Portugal, while the European Civil Judicial Court tried 100,000 women, 51,000 of them were burned, 25,000 in Germany during the 16th century. Martin Luther's followers. The power of the Inquisition was only for the baptized, who made up the majority of the population, but non-Christians also could have been tried for insulting the religion. The use of torture methods against those who were thought to be heretics is a familiar method of punishment for cutting off and burning people alive, so the numbers that were tortured reached 300,000 Protestants and 100,000 Bulgarian, French and Orthodox, and Muslims residing in Andalusia were tortured after their fall in the fists of the Christians. The first public investigator in the Inquisition was the Spanish Dominican monk Thomas Torquemada. Before the 15th century, the Catholic Church gradually suppressed heresy, and this was usually according to an ecclesiastical system, exile, and imprisonment. Although many states allowed the Church to use the death penalty, this punishment was not widely used, because this type of punishment had many opponents from the Church. In the 12th century, to confront the spread of Catharism, legal action against heresy became more widespread, and church councils made up of bishops and chiefs of bishops formed what is known as the Inquisition. In the 13th century, the Pope handed over the task of the Inquisition to the Dominicans, so the investigators worked in the name of the Pope and made full use of his authority, so they followed procedures of investigation that were common at that time, and they were prosecuting the heretics through the local authorities that were establishing courts to judge the heretics. And at the end of the 15th century the Inquisition was headed by the Supreme Inspector. This continued until the 19th century. A special office for the prohibition of books was established in the Vatican in the 16th century. This office was cancelled only in 1965. The office's goal is to prevent Christians from reading books that it considers harmful to minds or dangerous to faith. The Inquisition has become the subject of many literary works, such as Spanish Courts were the subject of the classic play Nobody Expects the Spanish Inquisition, which was referred to as the Sliding Doors movie. Edgar Allan Poe's short story Pit and Pendulum takes place during the Spanish Inquisition. The historical story Gorgon, written by Harry Turtledove and Richard Dreves, in which the Spanish Inquisition remains in place in Spain itself and extends to Latin America throughout the entire 12th century. The orthography of Camden to Voltaire contains a scene where the court finds both the narrator and Dr. Engels guilty of heresy. It was established in the early 13th century by the decision of Pope Greenward IX in 1233. Its goal was to fight heresy throughout the Christian world. What is meant by heresy here is any deviation, even a slight one, from official Christian beliefs. He was assigned to the clergy in various governorates and provinces. Each one of them was responsible for going after the suspects in his diocese. People were driven to the Inquisition just by suspicion, or by the neighbor's whim. They were subjecting the suspect to interrogation until he confessed his guilt. If he did not confess, they moved to a higher level, then they threatened him with torture. Then, many people collapsed, confessed their sins, and sought repentance. Sometimes it was given and absolved. But if they suspected that their repentance was not true, they would subject them to physical torture until they totally collapsed. Among the most famous who died in the burn was the famous Czech reformer, Jan Hus, a monk famous for his loyalty, piety and integrity, and he held the highest academic positions as Dean of the University of Prague at the beginning of the 15th century. But they accused him that he was claiming that the church deviated from the principles of religion, and that he claimed that some priests and bishops deviated from their true duty and concern for their personal interests and material exploitation of simple people. Many people gathered around him who felt his sincerity. Then the Catholic Church atoned him for the charge of heresy, and although they gave him safety after they summoned him to trial, they betrayed him and arrested him and threw him in the fire on the same day, that is on July 6, 1415. Among the most important who appeared before the Inquisition was the Italian philosopher Giordano Bruno and the famous scientist Galileo. Indeed, Copernicus, who says that the Earth rotates around the Sun, was spared only because of his extreme caution. He postponed the publication of his book containing his new theory until the exact day of his death. But this was not the line of Bruno, who escaped from Italy after engaging in monasticism for a period of time. Because of his attachment to philosophical ideas and his adoption of the Copernicus theory condemned by the Pope, they continued to suspect him and pursue him, at which point he was forced to flee and live on the move between France, Switzerland, England and Germany. He used to work as a professor in the universities of these countries that he passes through. He was known for his scientific excellence and genius, and even anticipated many modern theories that were later proven true. After long years absent from his country and feeling nostalgic for it, a wealthy merchant lured him from Venice. He asked him to return to educate his children and live safely in his country, Italy, but he soon betrayed him and handed him over to the Vatican Inquisition. So they cut his tongue and burned it. Giordano has become a radioactive beacon throughout European history. As for the famous scientist Galileo, he was threatened with the same fate had he not been corrected at the last moment, and he accepted to retract his famous theory. And so pardoned him. They did not carry out the death sentence. He was then transferred to house arrest in the outskirts of Florence and allowed to complete his research while on probation. And the Catholic Church did not recognize Galileo's right against it until more than 300 years have passed since his trial. The Holocaust lasted until the 17th century, and until the 18th century. To give one example, a famous incident took place during the height of the Enlightenment of a person called Jean-François de la Barre, that is, in the 19th century. They cut off his hand because he broke the cross, uprooted his tongue, and then finally burned him. He was a teenager, not older than 19. Voltaire took advantage of this issue and attacked the Christian fundamentalists hard. Another example is what happened to the philosopher Michael Servetus, who burned him alive in Geneva on charges of questioning the doctrine of the Trinity, which is one of the basic tenets of Christianity. In the 16th century, Spain became the largest Catholic power in the world at the time, and it was the envy of the Protestant world in the north. Spain was a model for an authoritarian religious state, so the church controlled and appointed the kings and heroes who governed its rulers called God's shadow in the land or the law of divine right, and to eliminate what he called then corruption and targeted those who were forced to convert to Christianity from Muslims and Jews. And then targeted other Christian beliefs, especially Protestantism, and the word heretics appeared, a description of those who disagreed with them in the specific explanation of the evangelical text by those committed to the Catholic Church. Thomas Torquemada, a Christian-affiliated cleric who headed the inspection body to search for these heretics, preached, tortured, and killed them if they did not return to the Catholic Church, and he was called the Great Inspector or Grand Inquisitor, and he executed at least 1 out of every 10 people appearing before his court. The Inquisition was the means of the Castilian kings to purify Spain of heretics and all those believed to be non-Catholic. This is despite the treaty signed by them. But even this solution did not totally succeed in solving the Islamic problem in Spain, so he resorted to collective expulsion. In 1609 to 1610, at least 275,000 people were expelled to neighboring Islamic countries such as Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and even some other Christian countries. Thus the problem was solved by radical eradication. Spanish Inquisition is often seen in literature and popular history as an example of Catholic repression and intolerance. Contemporary historians, however, tend to question the exaggerated theory of violence regarding the Spanish Inquisition. For example, historian Henry Common asserts that the myth of the torture madness of the Inquisition of torture is largely the invention of Protestant writers in the 19th century as an agenda campaign to discredit the papacy. Karen Armstrong also states that its activities have been overstated, whereas although from the 12th century until 1834 charges were brought against about 150,000 people by the Inquisition, the number of executions does not exceed about 3,000 since it was established. Spanish Inquisition until abolished in 1834. We done now. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.